Right, so without further ado, I think it's time to introduce you to today's panellist for this event, and it's Costin Matrelli, and he's from Segura Systems, who are providing this webinar for you today. And I will just pass you through to Costin's screen so he can share his slides with you. And once this is done, we'll be able to begin the presentation. Costin, as you'll see shortly, is the CMO of Segura Systems. His responsibility at Segura is for marketing strategy. He's previously been a management team member at 4 successful high-growth technology companies, which are Orchestream, Tideway Systems, Zeus Technologies, and OnApp. He's also worked with several global brands, including ABM, Amro, Nokia, and Ericsson, on technology strategy. So hopefully today you'll learn quite a lot of things that you didn't already know from somebody that's been in the business and has a lot of knowledge on this topic. So without further ado, I'd like to pass you over directly through to Costin, who will take you through his presentation. And again, if you do have any questions for him, you'll be able to pop them into the questions box and I'll put them to Costin at the end of the event. Thank you for joining us. Over to you, Costin.
Great. Thank you very much for that introduction, Heather. As Heather, thank you everyone for joining us. As Heather mentioned, we had a slight change of plan, and I'm taking the place of Peter Needle, Segura's CEO, for this webinar. However, Peter will be on hand for questions at the end of the webinar, so please do fire away with questions, and we'll get to them at the end. So I wanted to start off with a brief introduction to Segura for those of you that don't quite know us yet. Segura is all about giving deep visibility into manufacturing supply chains. We enable brands and consumers to know the source and the journey of every component of every product in real time. And Segura is able to map the end-to-end supply chain and track how orders and products flow across that manufacturing supply chain. So this gives brands an entirely new way of actually managing their manufacturing supply chains based on empirical data rather than just trust and guesswork. So Segura is used by several major brands to enforce ethical sourcing, improve product quality, maximize supplier rebate, identify supply chain risks. So plenty of solutions that people use this mapping and transactional flow capability to solve. Segura is a cloud-based solution, and it's easy to implement and gives actionable results very quickly as a result. As I said, we work with many top brands, including Debenhams, Reese, Hobbs. You can see some of the logos down there. And Segura was founded in 2012, so we've been around for a little while, and have offices in London and Loughborough, so a UK-based company. And we're backed by Octopus Ventures, one of Europe's leading venture capital funds. So that's what I'm going to say about Segura, the company, for the moment, but do feel free to ask more questions if you wish. So let's take a look at our list of 5 ways to guarantee quality and compliance. Well, first of all, I think it's worth understanding what benefits we're ultimately trying to achieve here. So first of all, brand protection. You, as a brand, want to make sure that product components are being sourced from known, high-quality and ethical companies. The last thing that you want is your brand appearing in an article about sweatshops or being associated with polluting a local river, for example. You also don't want components failing. For example, a poor quality batch of zips in your leather jackets will cost you a huge amount of money to manage returns and replacements, but also creates lasting brand damage. Secondly, regulatory requirements. You need to make sure that all of the appropriate certifications are in place. For example, FSC certification for your paper labels and cartons, or chemical tests, for example. And in some cases, failure to complete those tests or prove that you have completed those tests can be a very expensive process to remedy. And finally, cost saving and cost avoidance. So we discussed product returns in the leather jacket example, but you can also face significant remanufacturing costs due to non-compliance or non-completion, for example, of a color test approval. If two components of a garment turn up with completely different colors and your quality processes haven't caught that, then you're going to have to remanufacture that whole batch. You'll also be familiar with the time wasted by your teams every single day on chasing emails for approvals and reconciling quality data with purchase orders and trying to get to the root cause of where quality issues are happening. These are all things that are made worse by the fact that our supply chains are getting more complicated, more extended, more global, so this is what we're here to discuss fixing. So let's take a look at our 5 recommendations for guaranteeing quality and compliance in your manufacturing supply chain. So first of all, we think that one of the quickest ways to do that, to guarantee quality and compliance, is to mandate and enforce usage of nominated suppliers. Secondly, implementing a quality-gated order management process. Third, collecting and reviewing quality metrics for component suppliers. Fourth, using unique garment tagging to be able to trace problems straight back to the source. And lastly, being able to prevent orders being placed on factories that don't have a current audit in place or don't have any audit in place. So let's look at each of those one by one. So first of all, mandating and enforcing usage of nominated suppliers. Well, the problem here is that many companies just trust their tier 1 manufacturers to self-source. Well, that puts you as a brand at huge risk because you no longer directly control quality or compliance, however good your relationship is with that manufacturer. Even if you have a nominated supplier policy, it doesn't mean that manufacturers will follow it. If they can improve their margins by substituting a component from an unapproved supplier, then that might be too tempting for them to ignore. Especially if it's a component where it's very difficult to prove where the component has actually come from. In fact, we've seen cases where up to 80% of components have been sourced from unapproved suppliers, going directly against nominated supplier, going directly against the brand's nominated supplier policy. So what's the solution here? Well, first of all, obviously, implementing a nominated supplier policy if you don't have one yet. So this will help you to ensure known quality of components. It'll also likely mean a reduction in the number of tier 2 suppliers you have, which actually gives you some great added benefits. So because each of those now nominated suppliers are getting higher volumes overall, because you've got fewer suppliers for the same amount of components, you can access volume price breaks that you wouldn't have had before. So you might be able to get a lower cost on those components as a result. Secondly, you can reduce audit complexity and costs. So because you have fewer suppliers in your supply chain now, it's easier to make sure that every single factory has been audited. And of course, that reduces your costs of audit as well. And lastly, it opens up the possibility to capture extra revenue from putting in place rebate agreements with those component suppliers. So that's all well and good, but as I said, it's actually really hard to guarantee that your manufacturer is going to use those suppliers. So in order to guarantee that compliance, you'll need to implement closed-loop order tracking. So you can guarantee all orders for specific components are going to the right nominated supplier. And indeed, you can see which orders are actually going to unapproved suppliers. So we'll talk a little bit now about how you actually do that. So a quick example, a quick illustration of the problem we just talked about. A brand at the top there places a purchase order on their manufacturers, and the manufacturers break those down into the constituent components, packaging, trims, etc., and theoretically place sales orders with packaging and trim suppliers through a multitude of different ordering systems, which could be an online portal, could even be a fax or phone. However, it's quite likely that the manufacturer can find similar components from an alternative supplier who might have lower quality or might be producing those goods with poor ethical standards, but at a better price. So they order from there to improve their margins. Or they order one batch from your nominated supplier and the rest are copied elsewhere. And you as the brand are very unlikely to spot that the finished goods, and you're very unlikely as the brand to spot that in the finished goods, at least until the quality problems start rolling in. Or in the worst case, your branded components are discovered in a sweatshop that you actually knew nothing about. When those volume reports finally come back from the nominated suppliers sometime later, so what volumes were actually ordered from nominated suppliers, you can see the volumes don't tally with the finished goods you actually produced. Is there a one-to-one ratio between the finished goods and care labels, for example, because every one of your shirts has to have a care label? So you can tell that's not happened. But when you have hundreds or thousands of manufacturers that you have to manage, then it's almost impossible to manually work out what's going on without having an army of auditors crawling over that supplier base. And a couple of other problems that we often see, because you've not ordered the volumes you're supposed to from your nominated suppliers, your volume price breaks aren't met, which means that either your overall costs improve or you start to experience problems with your suppliers who aren't getting the promised volumes. It's really important to note, obviously, that clearly many manufacturers and suppliers do not do this and operate entirely ethically and within your sourcing policies. But first of all, in our experience, the reality is quite bad, and sometimes up to 80%, as I said, of those packaging and trims are not ordered from the correct suppliers. Second thing is you don't know which of your suppliers are operating within your policy and which aren't. So you need to be able to manage and measure this. So how do you do that? Well, what we can see here is that what many of our customers are doing is that they use Segura as a hub in the middle here, through which all orders are transacted through the different layers of the supply chain. So let's take a look. First of all, the brand places a purchase order in the normal way through their ERP system, but Segura pulls in that purchase order and then presents it to the manufacturer. And because we have a product, we hold a product catalog maybe imported from your PLM system. It's broken down into a bill of materials, making it easy for the manufacturer to create a series of sales orders for those components. Now, Segura knows if a component has one or more nominated suppliers. So for zips, for example, you might have 2 suppliers for zips that you're going to allow your manufacturing base to use. So Segura will know that this is a zip and can be ordered from two different places. So it can ensure that the right suppliers get the sales orders. So once that happens, then those suppliers are presented those sales orders again in the Segura portal. So in this way, those unapproved suppliers who are providing low quality unapproved components get locked out. Now, it's worth noting that the brand can allow manufacturers to actually invite suppliers to the system. So it doesn't have to be totally locked down. They usually do that for low-risk items so that manufacturers have some flexibility there. But the key thing here is that you as a brand can require that you approve those suppliers first for your own compliance purposes. So even if it's not a nominated supplier, you've still had sight of it and you know that they meet your key policies. And lastly, and best of all, you as a brand get a clear real-time view of manufacturing compliance with that nominated supplier policy over whatever time periods you need. And you can drill down to individual line items or individual purchase orders all through a single portal. So allows you to manage your manufacturing base much more effectively and make sure that everyone is following your nominated supplier policy. Okay, so number 2, implement quality gated order processes. So this is a bit of a mouthful. What do we actually mean by quality gated order processes? Well, the problem here is that when you've got disjointed ordering and quality approval processes, i.e. you have ordering in one system, quality approval processes in maybe several other systems, often what will happen is that purchase orders will get placed before all the appropriate quality approvals have been completed. Because it's just difficult to reconcile all this is in a high volume environment. But also it's difficult to prove who's messed up when things go wrong. Why didn't all of those approvals happen? So there's no way to actually hold people's feet to the fire, hold suppliers and manufacturers' feet to the fire and make sure they're doing the right thing. And there's a huge manual effort to track and trace all this information, which takes up a huge amount of your team's time. So what's the solution? Well, rather than having 5 different portals for chemical tests and color approvals and dip tests and artwork approvals and whatever else you need to have in place, instead provide a single portal. And secondly, make sure that that's linked to purchase orders. Then you can make sure that orders can't be placed either directly with your manufacturer or between your manufacturer and the component suppliers until the mandatory approvals are actually done. And what that means is that everybody is kept accountable and honest in the process, because you can drill into the data and see who did what happened. And finally, give your teams a single place to come and see which approvals are pending, which have failed, and which are approved, so that they can focus on the important things, rather than spending all their time reconciling emails with spreadsheets and order management systems trying to get to the bottom of this. So, sounds good, but difficult thing to achieve. Well, this is something we do with our customers all the time, and here's an example of part of an artwork approval process in Segura. This can be a process that takes place between a Tier 1 manufacturer and a Tier 2 packaging supplier. So, for example, if the order was for a care label, the purchase order for the labels could be prevented from being transacted until the artwork approval cycle was complete. And no doubt you guys will be familiar with this problem, especially with variable data components like care labels. So, problem 3, collecting and reviewing quality metrics. So, being able to manage all those approval cycles is great, but in a way it's a tactical fix. What about problems that keep on happening? How do we hunt those down? Is it a common problem, or is it one that's specific to one supplier or one component? Being able to find the root cause of those common quality problems is really hard without a 30,000 foot view of all of those cycles going on over time, because really, that old maxim, you can't manage what you can't measure. So what we suggest here is that you try and gather data on every approval cycle for every purchase order between your Tier 0, between Tier 0, the brand, the brand, and your Tier 1 manufacturers, but also between your Tier 1 manufacturers and your component suppliers, especially your nominated suppliers. Secondly, make sure that you are mining that data to find the common points of failure and therefore the root causes. And once you've found errant suppliers, for example, suppliers that keep on failing in particular quality approval processes, you can then implement a corrective action plan, and then of course be able to track how that action plan is working over time. And that can be across your whole base. It could be with individual suppliers, individual or specific countries, specific components, whatever you want to, whichever way you want to slice it. But what it does mean is that in this way, you can manage and track how well your quality and compliance processes are doing overall, and make sure that you're managing for continual improvement. So here's a quick example of a dashboard in Segura that the names have been redacted to protect the innocent, but or not so innocent. But you'll see how you can start to track all aspects of a quality program based on the results of each and every purchase order that flows down the supply chain. You can see graphs over time of how purchase orders are being transacted, what quality metrics you can apply to that. Okay, problem 4. Use unique garment tagging to trace problems back to the source. Well, once a quality problem hits the stores, it becomes really expensive to fix. What we've talked about so far is fixing problems, quite high up the sort of value chain. So making sure that we're fixing things as early as we can before they even get manufactured. In most cases, there. But once the product's manufactured, how do you trace the source of a garment and all of its components? It's really hard to do once the product's in store, and so it's really hard to dig down to the root cause of why those returns are happening. Why did you get a huge batch of leather jackets being returned? Were they all from a single manufacturer? Were the zips all from a particular place, if it was a zip that failed, for example? So the solution here is obviously to, as we're suggesting in the title, use unique barcodes or RFID tags in each garment, and then capture the range of codes per individual batch, individual purchase order in the manufacturing process with the suppliers for each of those components, and then implement a root cause analysis process based on that data that you can run every time you get a significant batch of problems, returns, or whatever it may be. Now, this obviously requires some sort of system to capture and correlate all this data and understand for each purchase order what all the components were, who the suppliers were. This is a very similar use case to the previous example I gave you of being able to track down root cause of quality problems, because that's really what this is. But what we're doing is just saying, okay, for this particular leather jacket that's hit the store, we can now trace that individual jacket down to the specific batch, and therefore to where each individual component came from. And we're working with brands every day to get this level of traceability into their supply chains. So number 5, prevent orders being placed on factories without a current audit. So brands increasingly have an obligation to ensure that all the factories involved in producing any of their finished goods have a current audit, in place. Obviously, legislation coming online in the UK and elsewhere is making this increasingly important and putting the onus on brands to take responsibility for this. So inadvertently placing an order on a factory that doesn't have a current audit can result in huge remanufacturing costs. So what's the solution here? Well, generally speaking, you'll have a spreadsheet that lists out all of the audits that you've done with your suppliers, and you'll have somewhere where you store all the audit certificates. However, for your purchasing manager, being able to understand what the expiry dates are for every factory is kind of a time-consuming manual process that is error-prone. So what we suggest is putting in place a database that manages all of those certificates and understands all the expiry dates for every factory in the manufacturing supply chain, and then makes sure that you can't, or your supplier or your manufacturers can't, place a purchase order on a factory where there is a missing audit certificate, if that's what you want to happen. So what that means is it really removes that source of error and allows you to guarantee that you have that level of compliance throughout your supply chain, not just with your tier 1 manufacturers. And here's an example of a set of certifications and audits that have been held against a factory, together with the validity dates that Segura can then use to prevent purchase orders being transacted. Okay, so conclusions. Fixing quality problems early can save huge costs later on. So we looked at how fixing quality problems when we're going through, for example, chemical tests and artwork approval cycles can save us huge costs. For example, getting the variable data wrong on a care label can result in you having to remanufacture that whole batch, rather than just making sure that the correct approval has been completed before the purchase order gets placed. When these problems get through to the shop floor, that becomes hugely expensive, but there are ways to make sure, again, that you can find the root cause of those problems and drive them out from your supply chain. Secondly, nominated supplier policies are important, really important, because it's a great way of guaranteeing that you get the right quality of components into your products, but it's not a silver bullet. You need to put in place the right systems, the right processes in order to enforce those policies. In many cases, your manufacturers will pay lip service to those policies or ignore them altogether. And so you need to have a way to be able to police that and ensure that the right thing's happening. Spot checks and manual processes are not enough. So you could look at this problem and say, well, actually, if I just do spot checks on these where quality control processes are failing and on compliance, then that'll be good enough. Well, you know what? It's not, because as soon as one of those, as soon as you end up with a recall in the shops, that's going to cost you a huge amount of money, and it may well have slipped through your spot check process. I think the key thing here is that that automating quality and compliance processes using the tools, the systems that are out there today gives your brand visibility and control of the quality of finished goods in a way that you've never been able to, never been able to have before. So on that note, I'm going to pass back to Heather for questions.
Right, that's great, thank you. First of all then, I think this is probably one that most people are interested in finding out actually. How long does it take to implement Segura?
Sure. So the process we normally take with our customers is to try and make sure that they can understand where the value lies for them as quickly as possible. So what we normally do actually is run a 3-month process with a brand in order to choose a specific set of components that they want to track from a quality and compliance perspective or for some other purpose. Choose a specific set of manufacturers, and then run a pilot based on that set of based on that set of participants. And then after that 3-month process, they can see how those processes are improved, how the visibility is improved across that set of suppliers, and for those particular components or products, and then allowing us and them to work out an appropriate rate of rollout to perhaps more countries, more products, more components, whatever is appropriate. So, short answer is they should would normally expect within a 3-month cycle for our customers to start to see value from the product.
Wow, that's quite quick actually, isn't it? Okay, here's another question for you. Does this work if I have manufacturers in other countries? And is it easy to onboard them?
Right, okay, interesting, yeah. So the key thing, Segura is a cloud-based solution, so it's actually very easy to deploy on a global basis. There's actually really nothing to implement in, there is nothing to implement in your own data center, which makes it one of the reasons it's so quick for a brand to deploy. But it also means it's very quick for the for component suppliers, for manufacturers to start using. and we kind of provide support and training for a brand's entire supplier base to get them up and running quickly. So yeah, it really doesn't matter which country those suppliers are actually in. And in fact, as I was saying before about the implementation process, one of the ways that we'd often do this is to choose a specific country. It could be India or Bangladesh or Turkey or something like that, and implement in that country, and then grow out country by country. It's just one approach. So yeah, very simple to do, and actually from a deployment perspective, actually not a bad way to look at rolling out the product.
Right, okay, that's good. So what sort of return on investment can someone expect from implementing Segura?
I'm sorry, Heather, could you repeat that?
Yeah, what sort of return on investment can someone expect from implementing Segura?
Sure. So obviously this is going to differ on a case-by-case basis, and I think in the specific instances we've been in this specific instance looking at quality and compliance, there are kind of three key areas to look at from an ROI perspective. First of all, there's looking at the cost savings that you're able to achieve by automating manual processes. So if you can free up your team from chasing approval cycles and that sort of thing, then and have them focusing on more strategic activities, like focus on the approval cycles that aren't working, focus on where we need to be fixing compliance around a specific supplier, for example. Then you can start to see how there are some specific cost savings there. There's also obviously a large element here, as we talked about, of cost avoidance, which from an ROI perspective, different people will have different ways of looking at this, given that it's it relies on the probability of something happening. Yeah. So for example, a recall, you could a recall, the cost of a recall to you, a brand, is going to be quite specific to you, and how you distribute your products and so on. And of course the probability of a recall happening because of a quality issue is going to be probabilistic. So that's something that we would look at on a case-by-case basis and help our customers to actually understand, based on their assumed cost of a recall or compliance problem, having to remanufacture a batch of goods, based on and looking back at historical data, how could they expect to improve that by implementing this sort of system?
Yeah.
And I think the third thing here to think about, although it's not specific to the subject matter of quality and compliance, but is very closely related to nominated supplier policies, is looking at actually how you can generate additional revenue streams by putting in place, for example, rebate programs with your tier 2 suppliers, which can create an extra stream of revenue into the brand and help them to fund some of these improvement processes, quality processes, compliance processes.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I mean, you've talked a lot about the benefits to the brands. So what are some of the benefits to the actual manufacturers and packaging and trim suppliers as well?
Yeah, okay. So I think one of the interesting things here, we talked a bit about about volume discounts, and that the sort of benefit that brands can get by consolidating down to some nominated suppliers. They get volume discounts with their tier 2 component suppliers, packaging and trim suppliers. Well, the flip side of that is you as a packaging and trim supplier, once a brand implements this capability, are going to get much more business than you were before. If the compliance levels with an approved supplier policy are particularly low, I mentioned, it can be as bad as 20% compliance or 80% non-compliance. But even if it's 50%, if it's 75%, then they can look at doubling their business maybe, because suddenly they're getting a significantly greater number of orders that they weren't receiving before. So there's a really clear benefit to them of actually participating in this sort of system. Yeah. For a manufacturer, I think that one of the key things here is you're a manufacturer sitting in the middle here, and you've got you've got a typical brand retailer who is asking you to fill in, is asking you to use 5, 6, 7 different systems in order to receive a purchase order, in order to go through different quality processes and compliance processes and so on. That's a real pain and takes up a lot of time and effort that frankly a lot of these suppliers don't necessarily have the time or resources to do.
Mm-hmm.
Equally, when they get a purchase order and then they go and have to go and order all of those components, zips and labels and buttons and thread and whatever else, again they have to go to 20 different systems. They have to go to the label supplier's system and fill in some data there. They have to go to the thread supplier system and fill in some data there, etc., etc. So the manual workload is pretty high, especially you can imagine in a high volume environment. So the benefit to the manufacturer here is that we're actually taking away a load of that process and making it a lot simpler for them to take a purchase order and in a sense automatically transact it with all of the component suppliers, which not only means that there's some manual effort taken out of that for the manufacturer, which is great, but also they're much less likely to experience errors on the way, in retyping and whatever else. So you're much more likely to get the right orders coming through all the way through the supply chain because they've been automatically linked up. So I think there's an illustration of some of the benefits for both of those tiers.
Yeah, so happiness all round by the sounds of it. It sounds like a great idea. Okay, so we have some we've got one here that says we have some very specific custom metrics that we track around quality. They want to know if they can customize Segura reports to show these.
Oh yeah, sure. So that dashboard I showed you was just an example of a dashboard. We will always work directly with brands in order to understand precisely which metrics they want to track. What do they want to put on the board table, and to be able to show, look, this is what we're tracking. This is the improvement over time, for example. So if we can capture it, then we can help our customers to generate a report, generate a dashboard to show them how that metric is tracking over time. Absolutely.
Excellent. Okay. And what sort of approvals processes are you able to track?
So yeah, I mentioned a few of them earlier, but I mean, really, what we have within Segura is a set of approval modules. There's a set of approval modules. Some of them are quite specific. So, for example, care label artwork approval, where we have some specific functionality to help you actually generate the artwork itself for approval, through to more generic approval processes where you might have a very specific approval process that you as a brand need to run. So we can just we can kind of customize that generic approval process module to say, okay, this is now going to we can now use this for your very customized color test approval or whatever it happens to be. So really, out of the box, you can use it for some very specific approval capabilities, but then if you have custom approval cycles that you want to manage, then it can do those can be customized to meet the precise requirement.
Okay. We currently use email and spreadsheets to track approvals. Can you explain the benefits of putting that into Segura a bit more, please?
Sure. So, I mean, I think one of the we see this quite a lot. You'll have teams of people working off spreadsheets for to manage approvals, and be constantly kind of chasing emails and so on, which kind of can work in a small environment. It's it's certainly doable. It's not the most efficient way to do things, but it can work. I think the issue is when you get a bigger team and multiple people involved, then it starts to get really complicated. So it's not just the problems of who's got who's got which who's in email contact with who, but also being able to understand being able to understand across a set of people or share across a set of people where the key problems are actually occurring. So I think that by putting all of that data into a shared sort of dashboard view of, here are all of the approvals that actually we as a team need to worry about and need to go and apply ourselves to, can be a step change in productivity for larger groups of people. And it's kind of especially the case where you've got separated out your sort of purchase order process from your approvals processes, because again there's a whole other step of reconciliation that needs to go on there that just isn't necessary. And so again, if you can automate that out, then suddenly you're freeing up your team's time to really address the issues rather than just be firefighting all the time.
Fantastic. Well, that's great. Thank you, everybody, for the questions that you've sent in. And I think we're just about come to the end of the time today. So I hope everybody's found the presentation to be informative and helpful. But obviously, if there's anybody else out there that has a question that they would like to ask of Costin or Peter, then the contact details are on your screen here, but you can email info@segura.co.uk, or alternatively you're welcome to phone them. They're in the UK, so 44 844 593 0200. And or if anybody really wants to, they can email myself, and I'd be happy to push any questions or queries directly back through to Segura. But thank you everybody for your time today, and particularly to you, Costin, for taking your time to present this to us today. It's really helpful. You'll all be glad to know that we've made a recording of this event, so it will be available as a replay from probably around early next week, so that if anybody wants to share it with one of their colleagues or listen again, it will be available as an on-demand session. So fear not if you've joined us late, you're able to listen again at a later date at your own convenience. So thank you again, Costin, and we'll hopefully hear from Segura again in the future. But today's been very educational and informative, so I hope it's been of benefit to all of you out there. Thanks again.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.